This is the second video for the study day at St Benet's Church, Cambridge, at which Rupert Shortt explores the credibility of the Christian faith, Putting Aside Childish Thoughts, or as the subtitle of his most recent book has it, God for Grown-ups. All three videos for this study day are on our YouTube channel, and you can find out more about the Learning and Formation programme at St Benet's by visiting our website, www.stbenetschurch.org.
It's time now to say a bit more about how our putative creator has been conceived in the major faiths. When Richard Dawkins is not insisting that science makes the very question of God unnecessary, he is keen to remind us that deities come in many shapes and sizes. For him, the variety of vegetation in the religious undergrowth is a further reason for hacking it all away. Once upon a time, people gave their allegiance to Zeus or to Wotan. In due course, polytheism gave way to henotheism, that's to say the worship of one god in a still crowded arena. And finally, monotheism as honed in a document such as Hebrew scripture. Dawkins sees biblical ideas about God as stitched from various kinds of ancient Near Eastern thread, meaning that the vision apparently does not differ in kind from those of neighbouring cultures. The Genesis creation story owes much to the Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Mesopotamia, for example. Abraham may or may not have hailed from Ur, but that city boasted a civic temple to the moon god Nannar, filled with smaller shrines to smaller departmental gods for camel drivers, cobblers, and so forth. Being ignorant and superstitious, people were only ascribing phenomena they didn't understand to the antics of this or that capricious figure in the sky. No one today has any truck with Babylonian or Canaanite deities, among countless others. The modern atheist come of age simply believes in one less God, QED. Whether this thesis is dangerous or not, it certainly shows that a little knowledge is a regrettable thing. It is also deeply unscientific. What Dawkins supposes to be a dart in the flank of his opponent is more like a boomerang. Outgrowing God shows no awareness at all of the markers set down by anthropologists and philosophers, let alone by theologians. Viewed from a wide angle, as it has unfolded over millennia, religion is certainly very hard to define. It would include rites in the ancient world, such as animal and human sacrifice, employed as forms of scapegoating. But to focus at any length on such terrain during a brief overview would be eccentric. Anyone wanting to discredit religion today needs to confront global faiths that have produced major bodies of critical thought and engage with definitions given by the sociology of religion, which sees its subject as involving an apprehension and symbolic representation of sacred or non-ordinary reality. An apprehension and symbolic representation of sacred or non-ordinary reality. Scholars in this field remind us that human beings do not merely investigate the natural world at a scientific level. We also try to make sense of our lives via all sorts of evolutionary adaptations, agriculture, dance, literature, that have emerged from animal play, animal empathy, ritual and myth during a long history of tribal societies without much sense of the beyond, through supernatural king-god monarchies, think of Egypt for example, to more recent societies with their religions of value transcending the brute givens of existence. I have reported elsewhere a common view that some especially important developments took place during the first millennium BC. The ideal was contrasted with the real. Visionary horizons of hope were set against the frustrations of the everyday world. Though expressed in different idioms across the globe, the quest for transcendence, that's to say a higher dimension of reality embodying more exalted values, arose in China through reflection on the way of nature, in India through worldly renunciation, In Israel, through prophetic denunciation, among other things, and in Greece, through theoretical reflection and the quest for wisdom. Religion naturally remains an elusive term now. It embraces both Sikhism and a creed without belief in God, such as Buddhism. But that does not warrant the claim that all faiths are mutually contradictory and that if one is right, all others are wrong. This argument is often deployed by hardline atheists as well as some exclusivist believers. Just think of Islam, for example. Islam explicitly teaches that Christians and Jews profess significant elements of the truth as people of the book. Moreover, the prologue to John's Gospel states that the Word of God enlightens all of humanity. A vital consideration, I would say, is this. The major spiritual belief systems have partly inherited and partly sloughed off perspectives that were widespread in antiquity. A process of spiritual refinement is certainly discernible in the Old Testament. This evolution was not without hitches here and there. It did not unfold in a laboratory. As we have registered, a qualitative leap is nevertheless evident in a growing awareness that God is not a thing among other things. The difference between monotheism and polytheism is not one of numbering, as though the issue were merely a matter of determining how many divine entities one happens to think there are. It is a distinction instead between two entirely different kinds of reality. The very division between monotheism and polytheism is in some cases a confusion of categories. Several of the religious cultures we sometimes mistakenly call polytheistic have traditionally insisted on an absolute differentiation between the one transcendent Godhead from whom all being flows and the various divine beings who indwell and govern the heavens and the earth. Only one God, says Swami Vivekananda, speaking for much of Vedantic and Bhaktic Hinduism, is the uncreated. The gods, lowercase g, though supernatural, belong among the creatures. Late Hellenistic pagan thought often drew a clear demarcation between the one transcendent God, ho theos, literally the God in Greek, and any particular local God, that's to say theos without the article, who might oversee some aspect of the natural world. Dawkins begins Outgrowing God by explaining the etymology of the word polytheism. But he misses the one distinction in Greek that really matters in this context. Incidentally, Thomas Aquinas himself could not have been clearer that God belongs to no genus. You cannot, to posit a crazy thought experiment, add up all the things in the universe, reach a figure of n, and then conclude that the final total is n plus 1 because you're also a theist. Divinity and creaturehood are too different even to be thought of as opposites. We can note furthermore that divine transcendence is pictured in broadly complementary ways across the major faiths. The conception I have in mind can be found in various forms of pagan belief deriving from late antiquity, such as Neoplatonism, in the three Abrahamic religions, in Vedantic and Bhaktic Hinduism, as I've indicated, in Sikhism, and in some aspects of both Taoism and Mahayana Buddhist visions of Buddha nature. They all tend to see God as the one infinite source of all reality, uncreated, eternal, omnipotent, omnipresent, transcending all things, and precisely by dint of not competing for space with creation, immanent to all things as well. The understanding of God in some traditions of Indian thought as infinite being, infinite consciousness, and infinite bliss is especially suggestive. It can be set alongside the picture of the Christian picture of the divine life as an eternal act of knowledge and love, and the emphasis in Sufi Islam on the shared roots of the terms being, consciousness, and bliss. In noting these affinities, a figure such as David Bentley Hart adds that they also connect with conceptions of religious practice found in several global faiths. Quote, to say that God is being, consciousness, and bliss is also to say that he is the one reality in which all our existence, knowledge, and love subsist, and from which they come and to which they go, and that therefore he is somehow present in even our simplest experience of the world, and is approachable by way of contemplative and moral refinement of that experience. Even a sketch as brief as this gives us the measure not only of Dawkins' tendency to cut corners, but also of his lack of intellectual curiosity. As it happens, he does realise that some forms of Hinduism profess belief in one God, behind and beyond all the others, but then makes nothing of it. Now, if you've been brought up assuming that Hinduism is the major polytheistic faith of the world, but then come to grasp that it is actually in some of its principal manifestations monotheistic, shouldn't that at least give you pause? Another telling point about Dawkins' opening salvo precisely concerns what he says about Zeus et al. Anyone who supposes that Greece's spiritual legacy consists mainly in tales of warring gods is wide of the mark. Out of all the great riot of classical thinking, the two figures who emerge as the greatest influences of all on Western culture are Plato and Aristotle. To see them as pagan prophets of the Christian revelation may seem like a land grab to the secularist, though it is perfectly reasonable to hold that the church reframed some of the noblest strands in pagan thought, effectively democratizing them through an emphasis on care for the outcast. For present purposes, we might simply note that neither of these two towering philosophers was a polytheist. Again, doesn't this possibly suggest that there might be more to the monotheistic instinct than first appears? Let us turn now from defensive comment to more positive visions. Ask people of faith today to give a rationale for what they are doing. And, as we have seen, they're likely to reply that their beliefs need viewing in the context of life as a whole. Ritual, including symbol and gesture, narrative, ethics, institutions, and personal experience all feed into the mix. Some will supplement this with observations about human nature and what is implied by a self-examined life. Some will echo the words of Simon Conway Morris, quote, the unsolved riddle of why human beings alone among creatures have language, music, cumulative technologies, laughter, morals, teaching, and come to think of it, religions, including atheism, is the elephant in the Darwinian room, unquote. In other words, we are free, accountable, and objects of judgment in our own eyes and in the eyes of others. We are motivated not only by desire and appetite, but by a vision of the good. We are not just objects in a world of objects, but also subjects relating to one another reciprocally. The philosopher Roger Scruton has summed things up with a dash of poetry. Quote, our form bears the mark of its peculiar destiny. It is capable of sanctity and liable to desecration, and in everything it is judged by a standard not of this world, unquote. This way of seeing ourselves does not point unavoidably towards a religious interpretation, of course, but it deploys categories that are supplied by religion and to be obtained only with the greatest difficulty without it, Scruton adds. Given the range of religious belief and practice, it may not be possible to produce an umbrella definition, but a general overview, avoiding too many hostages to fortune, could be that the major faiths have at their base an understanding of the onward flowing existence of the temporal world as owned and selved by various kinds of agent. At the centre, or one of the centres, if there is intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, stand human beings who not only occupy existence, but are alive to it, taking it in with intelligence and giving it out with loving care. And at its top stands a creative providence of which human prudence is to be an instrument. We can connect this with Rowan Williams's definition, one of the most succinct I know. Asked once by the broadcaster Melvyn Bragg to characterize his understanding of the Almighty, he replied that, quote, "God is first and foremost that depth around all things and beyond all things into which, when I pray, I try to sink. But God is also the activity that comes to me out of that depth, tells me I'm loved, that opens up a future for me, that offers transformations I can't imagine. Very much a mystery, but also very much a presence, very much a person," unquote. Now, we have noted the claim that only a theistic framework answers the ultimate question of why there is something rather than nothing. Dawkins does not just dismiss this argument, as classically stated by Thomas Aquinas, but misinterprets it so grievously that the God delusion and outgrowing God invite responses on more than one level. Known as the five ways, Aquinas' case requires knowledge of the Aristotelian background to be grasped in full. But it can be put in plainer terms without oversimplification. We are invited to look at the patterns and regularities of the world and develop them to a point where we can no longer ask an intelligible question. What came before us? What do we depend on? What does that depend on? What came before that? What does that depend on? At some stage, according to Aquinas, we get to a point where we can no longer ask the questions, what came before? Or on what does that depend? We have run out of things to tell in telling the story of dependence or causality. The point at which we run out of things to say and questions to ask is the moment where the language of God comes in. Not that we have reached a mathematical proof of God's existence, but because we have recognized that there is something about the way we are talking that needs reframing in a larger context. It is one measure of how shoddy a book, The God Delusion, is, that its author substitutes mockery for analysis in his discussion of the five ways. As David Bentley Hart, among others, has pointed out, Dawkins is innocent of the scholastic distinction between primary and secondary causation, in consequence, he thinks that Aquinas' talk of a first cause refers to the initial element in a sequence of separate causes rather than the ultimate foundation of reality. This mistake feeds another. Dawkins assumes that Aquinas' argument entails a belief that the universe had a beginning in time, and this St. Thomas explicitly denies. He does, as a Christian, accept the biblical revelation that the Bible was created in time, but he doesn't think that belief is completely essential. He thinks, for example, that it's perfectly possible that God could have brought into existence a world which is endless in time, but the question of creation would still arise nonetheless. Most egregiously of all, perhaps Dawkins thinks that the fifth way of Aquinas is a case for intelligent design like Paley's 500 years later, when in fact its focus is teleology or goal-directedness in nature, a subject of great interest to cutting-edge biologists right now, as we shall see later. Now, much more could be said at a technical level. I don't want to drown you in too much detail. I think for our purposes, a pair of points stands out. One is that although, of course, some aspects of Aquinas' medieval cosmology have been superseded, his core arguments are not invalidated by contemporary physics. Another scientist to miss the mark is Lawrence Krauss. He's a rather shrill ally of Dawkins, and they've appeared on American TV programs together to mock religious belief. And Krauss, who's produced a book called A Universe from Nothing, he's not really true to the title of his book, because his whole argument assumes the existence of a quantum vacuum. And make no mistake, the quantum vacuum is none other than the physical universe at an early stage. It's replete with multi-dimensional structure and non-linear equations of motion. It is, quote, about as much like nothing as a billion nuclear bombs are like nothing, in the words of a particle physicist I know. The physical chemist Peter Atkins at Oxford, another Dawkins ally, proves no more convincing than Krauss in accounting for existence as such. What Atkins calls a problem of the profoundest difficulty, namely the unfolding of absolutely nothing into something, is avoided by the claim that because the electrical charges and the angular momentums and the energies in the cosmos all add up to zero, absolutely nothing has only unfolded into nothing. Since nothing positive has to be manufactured, there need be no positive, specific, munificent creation, Atkins thinks. This is as though we were to argue that the Taj Mahal does not amount to anything, because it contains the same amount of stone as was quarried from the ground to make it in the first place. Two definitions of absolute nothingness can be judged more rigorous. One is the physicist Peter Hodgson. Simple or complicated, small or large, the passage from non-existence to existence is the most radical of all steps. It cannot be glossed over, and no one with any sense of ontological reality could accept this for an instant. However large or small the object may be, the passage from non-being to being is the greatest possible transition, and the transition from non-being to being is beyond the power of science to detect. Dennis Turner sums things up more succinctly still. Nothing has no process, no antecedent conditions, no random fluctuations in a vacuum, no explanatory law of emergence, and there being nothing for something to be out of, there can be no physics, not yet, for there is nothing yet for physics to get an explanatory grip on. The second point, already outlined, needs reiterating given its fundamental importance. To grasp the classical understanding of creation, both in the Abrahamic faith and other traditions, we need to be constantly on guard against lapsing into an assumption that God is one agent among others. Expressed diagrammatically, as I've tried to do in my book, God's causal relation to the created order would not be as the first arrow in a series of creaturely causes, but as a wholly different source, the cause or arrow holding up the whole chain of creaturely causes from below. A caricature of the theistic stance resurfaces from time to time, and it runs like this. You guys are saying that there can't be an infinite regress in a series of causes, so there must be an unmoved mover at the start. But this argument for God begs two questions, the atheist might continue. First, why can't there be an infinite regress of causes? And second, if there is a first domino to set the chain going, who made that? You believers also claim that God had no cause. In that case, why can't the unbeliever just retort that maybe the universe itself has no cause? The trouble is that the major exponents of the theistic argument, Aristotle, Plotinus, Augustine and Leibniz, among others, besides Aquinas, never propose anything as crude as this. None has been so callow just as to say that everything has a cause. What they typically say is something like, what is contingent has a cause, or what comes into being has a cause. The Aristotelian argument rests in part on the premise that what goes from potential to actual has a cause. And for Aristotle, when we trace the series of things being actualized, we are, if you like, kicking the can down the road. Suppose I stretch my arm. Its potential to move is actualized by signals in my brain. My brain function is enabled by molecular and atomic structure, which is in turn made possible by factors including the four fundamental forces of the universe. At each stage, the explanation is deferred. From a monotheistic standpoint, it's not until you reach a reality which can actualize without itself being actualized, which is always and already fully actual, so to say, that you have an adequate explanation for existence here and now. Without an on-the-move mover so conceived, we're left in mid-air metaphysically. Edward Fraser has likened it to placing books on a shelf, attaching the shelf to a bracket, and that bracket to a larger bracket, but somehow doing without a wall. I'm not proposing that there is no possible ground for atheism to stand on. There is, and it's given by atheists in a different intellectual league from Dawkins. J.R. Mackie, the Oxford philosopher, is a distinguished case in point. He concluded that existence is simply a brute fact. The trouble, though, is that recourse to a brute fact can never be the outcome of an argument. It's an assumption, a claim with no other foundation other than personal preference. That doesn't necessarily make it wrong, but it risks being subject to the charge of wishful thinking. None of this, as I have already indicated, is to suggest that we can give an account of God's being. Just as having some awareness that I exist in the world is not the same as knowing what sort of being I am, so apprehending the presence of God is a far cry from knowing what God is. Any deity sewn up in human language and categories would be an idol. But reason infers the existence of causes from the existence of effects, without always being able to stipulate the nature of the causes from the nature of the effects. If that principle holds even in mundane contexts, then it should certainly apply in a unique area of discussion such as this. Among more questionable moments in Outgrowing God comes in chapter 12, when Dawkins says, in effect, that belief in a creator assumes fine-tuning in the universe, whereas atheists can accept the possibility of a multiverse. Well, maybe we just got lucky, in other words. With this wave of the hand, he gets himself off the hook with respect to phenomena such as gravity. Many of you will know that if it differed from its value by 1 part in 10 to the power 60, then the universe as we know it would not exist. Or dark energy forming 70% of the cosmos. For the anthropic principle, for the anthropic argument, rather, that this energy would have to be tuned to about 1 part in 10 to the power 120. And then Dawkins moves on. Is he as rational as he thinks? Again, I wouldn't say there's a simple reply to this puzzle. Theists should not pretend that they have a trump card with respect to fine-tuning. It is rather a fascinating part of our profound lack of understanding of major features of the world. What it means is that neither Lawrence Krauss nor any religious believer has any business being simplistic about our ultimate origins, but the theistic claim that the world has been brought into being by a reality that is ontologically unlike it is still reasonable, and it would stand alone. It would stand also, in the case of a multiverse. Many cosmologists with a religious faith have no theological problem with the multiverse. Why shouldn't God's creativity and principle extend to many universes? We have seen that Dawkins pays notoriously little attention to his critics, even when corrected on errors of fact. Faced with the above, however, he might concede that his criticisms of Aquinas were crude, but add that his instincts are democratic. My target is the simplistic worldview of many ordinary believers, he might maintain. To my mind, this entails a misunderstanding of how all sorts of groups operate in practice. Divisions of labour take place across the board. Non-scientists of any faith or none may agree that they accept the scientific method in principle, but leave the detail to professionals. In the same way, religious believers, while disclaiming detailed knowledge of theology, could ground their outlook in a threefold awareness that we are embodied beings with the capacity to grasp meaning and truth, that this forms a gift, prompting awe, along with a heightened sense of ethical responsibility, and third, an acknowledgement of our status as grounded in a reality that freely bestows itself on us. As well as rehearsing other sorts of general observation outlined in my previous presentation, they would likely wish to focus on telling a story above all. Christians believe that God not only made us, but also redeemed us. They therefore underline themes including freedom and divine humility. Think of the lines of the hymn, "All praise to thee, for thou, O King divine, didst yield the glory that of right was thine, that in our darkened hearts thy grace might shine." Or Charles Wesley's, "I woke, the dungeon flamed with light, my chains fell off, my heart was free, I rose, went forth and followed thee." Jews, Muslims and others naturally have their own narratives of quest and fulfillment. In other words, for the monotheistic traditions, the reality of God is not seen primarily as a remote, offstage matter involving ultimate beginnings and ends in the grand narrative of nature, but rather an immediate and intimate presence in our responses to the call to live. The great faiths have been likened to water, shallow enough for the less well-educated to paddle in, and deep enough for the cultivated to cast out into the depths. But be warned, they can also be settings for much splashing in the shallows by those who consider themselves sophisticated, while the allegedly simple-minded navigate the high seas with assurance. Thank you.